Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sheena Pasco. I'm the Director of Marketing for the Startup Path. Welcome to the Startup Path webinar. Tonight's topic is on negotiation. We are pleased to offer these webinars because we believe that entrepreneurs are the drivers of wealth creation around the world. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I want to tell you about the resources that we've created for you on the Startup Path. Step 1 features our free webinars where you will learn the basics of starting your own business. Step 2 provides you with assessment tools to help you find the right fit between who you are and the wide variety of business opportunities that exist. Step 3 enables you to learn a business from a mentor. We currently have 24 mentors online who reveal their tips, techniques, and secrets to success in a wide range of industries. We've packaged each mentor's journey and advice into a talk show format that we call the Startup Experience. Steps 4 through 6 contain 21 online lessons that cover everything you need to know about starting, growing, and running your own business. The featured speaker in today's webinar is the Startup Path's resident expert in entrepreneurship, Dr. Tom Duening. Dr. Duening is the director of the Center for Entrepreneurship at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. He has been an entrepreneur since 1984 and has started and ran 7 businesses in his career. Dr. Duening has also written 12 books on business and entrepreneurship and has consulted with startups in a wide range of industries. Please be aware you may see the waiting room screen come up as we transition into Dr. Duening's presentation. Today he will be giving insight on how to negotiate. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Tom Duening.
Thanks, Sheena. Today we're going to be talking about negotiating, and this is something I think that all entrepreneurs need to learn. You know, I've been an entrepreneur for about now going on 27 years. And I don't think a day goes by where I'm not negotiating something, you know, whether I'm negotiating with my employees, negotiating with vendors, or negotiating with the individual that holds my lease. It just always seems like something's coming up, negotiating with investors and so on. So it's probably a skill that I think everybody can learn. We can all get better at negotiation. Certainly I'm a better negotiator now than I was 27 years ago. I'm more confident now than I used to be because I practice all the time. Once you're aware, really, of the prevalence of negotiations in your life, you really get a little bit more self-conscious about the process of practicing the little tips and techniques that you learn along the way. And you know, there's some people that are just going to be better negotiators than others just because they sort of have a communication skill or whatever it might be, interpersonal skills that are superior to what you might have, but that's not to say that you can't get better and become a better negotiator in your own right, and that's really what this is all about. I think entrepreneurship is about that in every possible way. Everything that we do, there's always somebody that can do it better than us, but you know, as an entrepreneur, you're just not going to give up. So you just say, okay, I'm going to learn, I'm going to become the best I can be. So let's talk about negotiating. And you know, negotiations, even though they happen in so many different and varied settings, there's some elements of negotiation that are going to be the same. So number one, you know, is going to be you got interdependence. So each party in a negotiation sort of is dependent upon or affected by the other. And you know, to some extent, all negotiations are sort of characterized by conflict. And even though you know you might have a great relationship with somebody that's going to buy your products and services, at the end of the day, you got to ask for money, and it's the asking for money or the asking for the completion of the transaction that oftentimes is a real sticking point for a lot of entrepreneurs. They create value. They don't mind going in and talking about the wonderful value that they've created. But when it comes down to actually asking for the check or the payment, a lot of times that's a difficult thing. I know it was for me in my early career. I remember some very funny circumstances early on where I had to ask for money, and I literally stammered over the request. I don't do that anymore. I'm very comfortable now asking for money. But in the early days, that was something that was very difficult for me. You don't get into a negotiation unless it's an opportunistic interaction, which means that each party has to believe that there's some outcomes that are available to them by virtue of entering into this negotiation. You know, and negotiations can be difficult to enter into because they can be emotional, they can be time-consuming, they can be exhausting, you know, and so there has to be some possibility for opportunity for both parties. And, you know, at the end of the day, there also has to be some type of possibility of agreement. I wouldn't enter into a negotiation with somebody that I didn't think I might be able to reach some type of an agreement with. So, you know, in order to be able to reach agreement, you have to seem to be agreeable. So that's interpersonal skills, right? And so if you enter into a negotiation and you begin to lay down the law and you draw a line in the sand and you say this line will not be violated, well, guess what? You know, the other party might say, you know, it doesn't look like there's even a possibility of agreement here. So we're not even going to enter into the negotiation. I like negotiation because basically it means to say that you can get almost anything you want if you're open-minded enough to allow the negotiation process to run its course. And that's what you need to do as an entrepreneur. You really have to be open-minded. You're going to get investors, you're going to get bankers, you're going to get others who say, no way, you know, they might draw a line in the sand, especially with bankers because a lot of times they're very young, loan officers are very young, and they haven't developed their negotiation skills, and they just start drawing all these boundaries. And if you have learned the skills of negotiation, no is never the answer that you hear. You hear, you know, maybe not today or maybe not in this way, but somehow or other, if you're open-minded enough and you understand the negotiation must include the possibility of agreement, you will be agreeable. And that means that you have done your part, and now you just have to get the other party to do their part. So the conventional negotiations are going to focus on winning, right? So this is maybe kind of what we see if we look at like sports contracts or something like that. We always see this adversarial kind of thing going on, and usually there's a winner, and oftentimes, you know, when there's a winner, there's a loser. And, you know, that's kind of the false impression that a lot of people have about negotiations. And, you know, we think that it's the essence of negotiation is to assert your position and the personal preferences, and then only very, very stubbornly will I give in anything at all, right, in the way of a concession. And of course, that means that probably the agreeableness factor that we talked about in the last slide is not going to be something that the other party detects in you, and it could be difficult to reach any kind of an agreement whatsoever. A lot of times, you know, if we're unskilled negotiators, we'll see compromises based on arbitrary divisions, like, hey, let's split the difference, right? And you know, as an entrepreneur, you know, that might be something that you do early on in the name of expediency, because you just got to get something done. But if you end up leaving money on the table time and time and time again, your business might not be able to survive. Other things that is conventional negotiations are, you know, threats and bluffs and other kinds of tactics that unskilled or unpolished negotiators will use techniques like that. So in order to rise above that, in order to become a true professional and expert entrepreneur, you need to understand that there are different ways of negotiating. So we're going to talk about interest-based negotiations. And interest-based negotiations separate the people from the problem. Because as entrepreneurs, a lot of times the relationships that we're building are the relationships in which we're going to enter into negotiations. So you're going to be building relationships with vendors, you're going to be building relationships with customers, and you don't want to have this adversarial thing going on. You want to have a relationship for the long term. If you have a good client, you don't want that client to go away because you beat the heck out of them on pricing or something like that, or a good vendor. You don't want that vendor looking for other opportunities to sell their wares at a higher price because you've just been beating the heck out of them. So what we do in interest-based negotiations is we separate the people and the relationship that we have with the people from the problem itself. So you kind of put the problem in a little bubble. And both parties now can sort of identify that problem as sort of existing separate from the relationship that they have that's been working or you know, working in both their interests for a period of time. So we focus on the interests of each party, not their positions, right? So what is their interest? What do I need to be able to provide to them to get them to say yes to my needs? That's the key, is to listen to what they need and then to be able to negotiate a way to meet their needs and your needs at the same time. So you're inventing these options for mutual gain and insisting on objective ways of measuring the criteria. And I'm telling you, I've been I've been in entrepreneurship, as I said before, for 27 years, and I don't think I became a fairly decent negotiator until about 10 years ago. And the reason I became a better negotiator is because I was building a company in India, and the Indians are exceedingly good at hiding their feelings and hiding their true interest in some type of a negotiation. And so you have to be extremely patient, and you have to come out of your so-called Western or American shell in order to be able to be effective in those environments. And so I was forced to become a better negotiator, and I'm really glad of it. And I discovered a lot of these concepts about negotiation. These are not mine. These are concepts from the best practices that I've been able to find in the research literature, and they resonate very well with my experience in negotiation. So when is the interest-based approach appropriate? Well, when the other party is willing to work with you and problem solve. You have to have, sort of a trust and have an interest in maintaining an ongoing relationship. So, for example, when I go buy a car, right? Especially if it's a brand new dealership and I really, don't think I'm going to be working with this dealership long term or whatever, then you're just trying to beat the heck out of them and get the best price you possibly can, right? And you might even just say, yeah, I'm not interested, and walk away until they grovel at your feet. I'll give you an example. I was in Istanbul, Turkey, at the Grand Bazaar looking for a leather jacket, and I found one that I liked, and the guy was selling this leather jacket. It was on the rack for $750. We negotiated for 3 hours, and he was trying to win me over with tea and flattery and all kinds of things, and I just wouldn't budge. 3 hours I negotiated with this guy. Finally, I said, enough's enough. I walked away. We were at about $250. I walked away. I was walking through the Grand Bazaar. The guy came chasing after me, brought me back up into his shop, and we finally negotiated a price of $175. So you can see that, as you get, I was ready, willing, and able to beat the heck out of this guy because I was never going to see him again. And I might as well get my price, in that situation. I just was going to be uncompromising to the extent I was ready to walk away. I never possessed the jacket. I still have it to this day. This was like maybe 15 years ago that I did this. Anyway, so if the ongoing relationship is important, you want to do this interest-based approach. You want to commit to carry out the agreement, and that means, of course, obviously you do that in the case of a trusting and a long-term relationship, and a quality agreement is more important than an expedient one, which, we talked about expediency before, which means I just need to get something done. And I'm not that interested in looking at the fine details. Just let me get it done. Now, early days in entrepreneurship, running a company, starting a company, you might negotiate some contracts where you're going to lose a little bit. You're going to lose some money, but you don't want to do that time and time again. The interest-based approach is unnecessary, like I mentioned before, in the case of the Grand Bazaar, for example, where the ongoing relationship is simply not important. The negotiation is about distributive, and that means you're going to get something and I'm not. And, I want to keep as much of my money as I possibly can, and I'm going to give as little to you as I possibly can. And, both parties are really just interested in achieving their own interests and nothing else. The relationship is completely unimportant. This is probably the most important concept that most people don't know about, which surprises me because this should be a term that sort of every business school automatically delivers to you, almost like they talk about the importance of saving more than you spend and things like that. Well, the BATNA is basically your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. BATNA stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement, and that means that you know what your walkaway alternative is. Now let me kind of explain how this works. So when you go into a negotiation, there's no guarantee that you're going to walk out of the negotiation with some type of a compromise that is suitable to you. And because of that, right, there's risk. The risk is that you might have nothing more as a result of the negotiation than what you currently have. So one way to be strong, and if that's, if that seems like that outcome is just intolerable, you're going to be in a position of weakness going into the negotiation. So one way to avoid going into a negotiation in a position of weakness, in the sense that, boy, I just simply couldn't tolerate this thing not working out in my favor, is to know what your BATNA is. And that means that you're happy with what you got, you're getting by with what you got. Is it possible that that you could walk away from this thing if you're not able to achieve a negotiated outcome that is suitable to you? And you have to develop that mindset. Most of success in life comes from the mindset that you bring to whatever it is that you're doing. So if you're a pessimistic individual and you look at everything that happens as outside of your control and the result of forces that you have nothing to do with, that's called an external locus of control. And that means that, you're going to probably have a lot of disappointment and maybe even get to a point of depression. And that just simply means learned helplessness. Depression is learned helplessness, and that's a mindset. Optimistic people, on the other hand, believe that most things that happen to them are under their control. And when things don't work right, they simply look inside and say, I didn't do a good enough job. It's up to me to make a difference in the future. And so mindset matters a lot. And when you go into a negotiation, if you're ready, willing, and able to walk away from the negotiation because you haven't been able to achieve the compromise that is suitable to you, that is a position of strength. And going into a negotiation from a position of strength is going to lead more often, is going to be more likely to lead to your success in that negotiation than having a mindset of defeatism or a mindset of you need to compromise at all costs because you simply need to achieve that outcome. So you don't want to disclose your BATNA, and you want to know the other party's BATNA if you possibly can. You want to know what their walkaway price is, because if their walkaway price or their walkaway terms of agreement are not suitable to you, then it doesn't even pay to go into the negotiation, right? So in order to prep for your negotiation, obviously you have to say, what are my interests? What do I want out of this? And what are theirs? And where, what are the sources of agreement? And always begin a negotiation from, these are the areas in which we agree, and we can build upon that. Know your BATNA and know theirs. What do you know about their circumstances that might affect the negotiation? Are they under a time crunch? Do they have no alternative other than you as a provider of whatever it is that you're negotiating? So as long as, the better you know those circumstances, the more you know what you're up against. And it's also important to know their negotiation style. So, for example, a lot of companies will play what we call good guy, bad guy. And that means that they'll have somebody show up for the negotiation that tries to win you over, tries to develop a relationship, tries to be a nice guy, and then when it comes time to actually making a decision, that good guy will say, well, I can't, that's not for me to decide. I'll have to take this to, my board or whatever it might be. And that bad guy then is going to potentially say, we're not going to agree to these terms, and just keep hammering away at you like that. So understand their negotiation style. If you understand the style, you'll be able to work with them. So these are the different outcome types, the win-lose negotiation. That means I'm the winner, you're the loser. We call this zero-sum thinking. That means whatever I get, you don't get. Lose-lose negotiation, this is sort of, sort of like biological warfare, I guess, where just everybody just loses, nobody comes out on top and something like that. And what we're really looking for in terms of interest-based negotiation is a win-win scenario where both parties believe that their interests have been met, that they're going to get from the agreement what it is that they need, and that the relationship is going to be able to continue on long after this agreement has been executed. So this is really about positive sum, and when you're in business, this is the best of all worlds. This means that you're getting what you need in the way of maybe payment or compensation in some other way for what it is that you're doing, and your clients and partners and customers and vendors and so on are getting what they need. So how do you create win-win outcomes? So like I said before, we want to concentrate on each side's fundamental interests. You want to create an appropriate climate. So, you want to make sure that you understand the other party's time frame, for example, so that if they need time to sort of get to their attorneys or get to their accountants or whatever it is that they need to do to be able to evaluate the evolving terms of a potential agreement, you want to be able to enable that. You want to communicate clearly so that when you get to a contract, and by the way, there's no such thing as a perfect contract, and that's why good communications can really help the process and lower the costs of coming to an agreement. The more time you have to spend with attorneys splitting hairs over the definition of various terms, the more it's going to cost you to come to an agreement. So really communicate clearly, be open-minded, don't try to overinterpret things. I've always found that, whenever I'm negotiating a contract, I don't quibble over details, and I've got to tell you, I've never been burned by that. I've never been burned by somebody saying, well, this is what we meant by that term, and you interpreted it this way, so that's your problem. I've never had that happen. If you understand what we call the spirit of the contract or the spirit of the agreement, it seems to me that, as an entrepreneur, certainly you've reached the end point, and let's get moving and delivering value and exchanging, whatever it is that we're exchanging here, dollars, hopefully. You want to maybe develop sort of a systematic process for negotiations. If you're the decision maker, that's fine. Make sure that people understand who the decision maker is on your side. If you are representing the company as an agent, that somebody else is the decision maker, don't make it seem as if you are, and then play good guy, bad guy later on. That doesn't help. And then make sure that you understand your own effectiveness in negotiations. If you get up against somebody who's really skilled at it, be on your toes and slow the process down. Because they're going to be really good at what they do, and you may need more time to get what you want. So here's some strategies to use, and that is to understand the substantive outcomes, and that means what are the interests that we're trying to achieve. Those are the substantive outcomes of a negotiation. The relationship outcomes, obviously, that has to do with, what happens to the relationship as a result of your negotiating style and the actual substantive outcomes that have been achieved. If both parties' interests are met, then the relationship should continue without any issues. So make sure that those are part of your thinking. Procedural outcomes means, did you follow the process of a negotiation that gave everybody an opportunity to have their say? So to achieve these acceptable outcomes, you need to obtain these substantial results. You need to influence the balance of power, and that means that you're trying to get to a point where both parties feel as though their needs are being expressed appropriately, their interests are being expressed appropriately, and each party has an opportunity to influence the outcome. A constructive climate is, like I said, part of the procedure of the negotiation, where every party has an opportunity to spend the time they need to look at things and to make sure that their interests are being appropriately interpreted. And then some flexibility may be necessary. You know that oftentimes in life, as in business, things happen, and you're in the middle of a negotiation, and guess what? The party that you've been negotiating with gets the flu, or something happens in their family, and you need to have some flexibility to slow things down and give them an opportunity to respond. Some of these are pretty obvious, it seems like, but you never know in a negotiation what's going to pop up. And sometimes you do need to be flexible, and other times you need to say, that doesn't seem to me like a reason to sort of slow this thing down. Is there some way that we can work around that issue or work around that problem so we can continue to move towards a finish line? Obviously, when you're working in an entrepreneurial venture, you need to get to the finish line quite often in the early days to get a check in the door and be able to make the payments that you need to make. And so, sometimes you need to push a little harder than others. But if you're right up front with people and you tell them, look, we're a startup, we really don't have time to wait for this. Is there some way we could sort of accelerate the process? The honest approach, the open approach, to me, has always worked the best. when you're in the middle of trying to get something done and somebody's giving you some pushback that seems to be not quite legitimate, or maybe they're not given the same kind of urgency to the issue as you are. To be open and honest and give them the sense of being so and being sincere about where you are in your business. I mean, it's amazing how much people want to help you. So here's some things to think about. The pacing of the negotiation. Do you want to get it done quickly, or do you want to get it done more slowly because there's a lot of details? Do you want to be highly formal, and that means basically you're walking with your briefcase all the time into a boardroom and sitting down and negotiating, or fairly informal, which I prefer. I like informal negotiations. I've never had a problem with informal negotiations. Typically it does come down to a written agreement, but even then, I've had some clients in my business in India, for example, where I've gotten 4 or 5 different contract forms from a single company, and they all say, well, we want to have a standard form contract that we give you, but it's never that way. And I move forward, and as long as you've got a purchase order number or something on that contract that enables you to do an invoice against that, then you're fine. You can do an agreement that is oral. I don't typically like that. I like written agreements, but even then, you don't want to go overboard, and you want to make something pretty simple. As a company, you can facilitate that process by having standard form contracts or standard form agreements that you use, and you just present that to the client. Say, look, here's our standard agreement. If this meets with this meets with your interests, then you can sign this agreement and we'll go forward. Right? Or you can wait for them to present an agreement. But one way to sort of accelerate the process and keep the attorneys out of it and the expenses is to have some standard form contracts that you use over and over and over again, with blanks in the appropriate places where you might fill in some variables like pricing or client or whatever. So the bluntness of the communication, is it like person to person? These are the 2 people negotiating the deal, or do you have other parties that are in there as well, and you have some indirect communications? And then the time frame, do we want to get this done tomorrow? Do we want to get this done in a week? And of course, the pacing is sort of related to that. Pacing, might mean, what do you expect in the way of reply every time you send, a response to some type of request for some type of an amendment or something. That would be pacing. The time frame has to do more with the actual time to the conclusion of the negotiation. Here's some problems. There's perceptual errors. We misinterpret what people are saying. We misinterpret their body language. We misinterpret their intentions. We have unrealistic expectations about likely outcomes. Therefore, we might show disappointment. You talk about the poker face, and that's not necessarily something that you need to try to cultivate as an effective negotiator. But you also don't want to have these unrealistic expectations so that you demonstrate frustration, you demonstrate disappointment, you demonstrate impatience or whatever it might be. Negotiations is an art form, and you can win you can gain your interest in a negotiation, but you have to be able to allow these things to have their own time and place. When I was younger, I was selected to become the assistant dean of the business school at the University of Houston when I was 34 years old, and that was right out of graduate school after I was sold off my interest in my first company. And I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I had 6,000 students. I had 150 faculty, and here I was, probably the youngest, certainly the youngest administrator in the entire university system. And I mean, everything seemed to me to be critical. I would respond quickly to things. And what I learned in the 9 years that I was the assistant dean was that oftentimes if I didn't react in the short term and just let issues sort of take their course, they oftentimes, more often than not, resolve themselves in the way that I wanted them to be resolved. And boy, I'll tell you, I carry that with me even today. I don't respond almost to anything that comes my way, not immediately. I let it sit. I let it simmer. And then certainly my emotions are died down, so my reaction that I do eventually provide, if it's required, is going to be different than it would if I did it in the heat of the moment. And typically, I don't have to intervene at all. And boy, that is just so much better. So realize that unrealistic expectations, not having your BATNA can lead to some kinds of behaviors that in fact are going to be counter to your interests. And even though in the short term, right at the moment, it might seem like somebody is trying to subvert you, if you're persistent and you're dogged and you are patient, believe me, I don't know why it is, but it almost always works out in your favor. So you don't want to have an unwillingness or inability to engage in real negotiations, and that's what I'm saying is you're developing this professionalism, this expertise, these skills that are expected when you go and work with bigger clients. And sometimes the perceived non-negotiability can also be a problem in negotiations. So you don't want to seem as though you're not open to negotiation. Now, not everything can be open to negotiation, but for the most part, most things aren't. So don't have a knee-jerk reaction to an inquiry from a client, for example, that something would be non-negotiable. Listen to what they have to say and understand your own interests in that context and see whether or not, perhaps something doesn't even just work itself out in the long term. Here's some gambits. Negotiating gambits are sort of ways to enter into negotiations or close negotiations, tactics that you might use. So when you start a negotiation, you always want to ask for more than you can get. It's pretty standard, right? So if I want to go to a new employer and I want a certain salary, I want to make at least $80,000. Well, ask for $100,000, right? And get them used to that number. You say, oh, if I ask for $100,000, well, maybe they're going to walk away. They're not going to walk away. Employers need employees. They need people. And they need good people. And if they're talking to you and you're at the salary level, why not ask for more? And then let them get adjusted to that and bring it down. So you're always going to offer less than you're willing to pay. So if the other party opens high, you're going to offer much less that you're willing to pay. So let's say I'm buying a car, and the guy says, well, I want to sell this car for $19,000, right? So I'll say, well, I'll give you $14,000 for it. Now I know that the final price is going to be somewhere between 14 and 19. I don't know where it's going to be, but I've started very, very low. And this sort of gets a way to sort of bracket, the negotiation. So if this individual is a very motivated seller, I might get closer to the 14,000. If this seller has got a lot of their potential buyers, I may have to go closer to the 19. But you never want to say yes to the first offer, and you want to try to get the other party to make an offer first if you possibly can. Lots of ways to do that. You dance around. You just say, look, what's your budget? How much? What do you think would be a fair price for this? Or you come out with a price sheet, right? If you're an entrepreneur and you walk into a big client and they say, well, we want to know your pricing, you give them a price sheet, right? And of course the price sheet is just what you call your standard price. It has nothing to do with what you might negotiate, but at least that gives them a sense then of where you're starting at. And if you can get the standard price, great, done. If you have to negotiate a little bit and come down for volume pricing, whatever it might be, at least they believe they've been treated fairly, right? Because they say, well, they started with the standard price that everybody else gets, and man, they came down 10%, gave me a great deal. The flinching at the first offer, I think, is the most powerful thing I've ever done, and the most powerful thing I've ever learned about negotiations. So somebody says a certain, like let's say you're negotiating a salary for a position, and they say, well, look, I'll pay you $150,000, right? So you're talking to them on the phone, and they can't see when you flinch and blinking your eyes and maybe twitching. You just go, ooh. Ooh, and sit there silently, right? Ooh. And the silence is going to drive them crazy. Whoever it is that's making you the offer has to try to land you. And you've just now given them this horrible feeling that perhaps they've insulted you, perhaps they have been so unrealistic in their own research that they haven't even come close to what your actual price is. And I love that. I mean, it's like that, that stone cold social silence that happens sometimes when nobody knows what to say next, and everybody sits there getting nervous because it's silent, right? It's the person that speaks next that typically is the one that people regard as the most adept and the most tactical of the group. So here's some bargaining gambits. You never want to offer concessions until all demands are known. So make sure that you understand all the interests of all the parties before you begin to make any concessions at all. You may want to negotiate how, in fact, the negotiation will take place. And, you know, you don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but you want to make sure that everybody understands that you're trying to get to, you know, some type of an endpoint in this particular time frame. You're going to do it either formally or informally, like we talked about before, and things like that. And you also want to know that you're talking to the person that can actually make a decision. You don't want to be negotiating. If you're talking to an agent, that's one thing. And as long as you know that this is not the final decision maker, the problem with that is you never know what they're communicating to the final decision maker, and so that's always tough. On the other hand, when I'm representing my own company, even though I might be the decision maker, I always like to condition the agreement on approval of what I call a higher authority, especially if it's a complex thing. So that gives you some time. So you negotiate like crazy. You know, you say, okay, now I got to take this to my board. Right? So whether you get a board or not, that gives you some additional time to really look at things to see whether or not your interests are being met. So you never make a concession without asking for one in return. And you want to keep track of all concessions on each side so that you understand, you know, at the end of the day, what the negotiation has led to. Here's just some other things, the good guy, bad guy. We talked about that already. And I always like to use this one. It's like, you know, whenever I go buy something like a car or something, I go shopping on my own, and then I always get more time by saying, well, look, I got to go talk to my wife. You know, I can't buy this car without talking to my wife, you know. And of course, every salesperson knows that you're just simply not going to relent on that. And they try and try and try. What can I do to get you in this car today, right? Ain't going to happen. I got to go talk to my wife. Well, can you call her, have her? No, she's out of town right now. She's coming back next week. Whether that's true or not doesn't matter. What matters is you've bought some time, and you basically placed that other party, you know, you're influencing the balance of power. You want to maintain a poker face, and what that means is you don't want to, like I said before, you don't want to go in unrealistic expectations and, you know, demonstrate frustration, impatience, disappointment, whatever. Negotiations have a life of their own, and you need to be able to allow them to take their own good time. And that means you have patience and persistence, and always want to appeal to common ground. Here's some closing gambits that I like to use. The nibbling whittling is kind of neat. So after you've had this long negotiation, right, and everybody's happy, and you get to the signing ceremony, and everybody's sitting down, and you're finally going to sign the agreement, and you go, you know, if I could just get another $50,000, you know, up front, as opposed to, you know, in the middle of this, that would really help us be able to, you know, and by now people are like, okay, whatever, you know. So, you know, it doesn't hurt to try that. And, oh, by the way, it's going to happen to you. So now that you know that it's a gambit, you can decide in advance whether you're going to make any kind of final concessions without maybe asking for something in return. But, you know, you need to know that these things exist. Reframing the deal is a way of sort of it's sort of like nibbling and whittling. It's just another way of doing so. And as I just mentioned, it would be like asking for more money up front than maybe is been promised down the road, or asking for you know, some other kind of special dispensation in, you know, that you really truly need. I mean, don't risk the relationship by being, you know, aggressive at your nibbling and whittling. It's called nibbling because you're going to ask for just a little something more that might help you perform a little bit better. And I always like to appeal to ego and say, man, you've been fantastic. You know, you're a great negotiator. I've truly loved working with you and your team. Oh, by the way, is it possible, you know, I really enjoyed working. Is it possible we can get $50,000 more up front on this deal? And, you know, if you've appealed to their ego, you know, it may get them to the point where they feel, in fact, like they can make a decision like that, and they're just going to go ahead and cut it, right? So that's it for our discussion on negotiations. I trust that it's been helpful to you. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, I think all entrepreneurs are negotiating all the time, and you will find that is definitely the case for you. So I wish you well on your negotiation, and I wish you well on your venture. And I'm going to turn this back over now to Sheena Pasco.
Thank you, Dr. Duening. It was great to get your expert advice on negotiation, and I absolutely love that flinch tactic. It's amazing. And it's amazing how important negotiating skills really are, not just in business, but everyday life as well. And Dr. Duening provided us with a lot of information in this short webinar, but the more knowledge you have and the more you hear things, the better you can get at negotiation especially. So we have a lesson on negotiation available to you in Step 5 of the Startup Path. The lesson is titled Networking and Negotiation. I urge you to register for Step 5 and learn more about negotiating and really hone in those skills. In fact, for joining this webinar today, we're offering you a 25% discount on Step 5 or any other item on the Startup Path. There's a coupon code at the top of this slide. Write it down, use it when you check out, and get started today. This discount is being offered only to the first 100 people who decide to take this first step. Of course, we offer a 100% money-back guarantee if you are not satisfied. We look forward to helping you reach your dreams through owning your own business. Please stay in touch. Let us know how we can help and how you are doing. Thank you for joining us, and have a great evening.